So I'm happy to be here to present the beginning of a longitudinal study that we are conducting. This is a study that's under the supervision of Fred Genesee, who specializes in bilingual acquisition, as well as Robert Savage, who's a reading intervention specialist, and Corinne Haigh, who's here as a postdoctoral student who's continuing this project, and her previous research has looked at lexical access in bilinguals. I'm a PhD student, and I'm also a speech-language pathologist at a pediatric hospital in Montreal. So we know that immersion schools have been around now for a little over 40 years, and the general success of these programs has been well documented. In fact, we have evidence that children, even with intellectual impairment, do equally well in these programs. Children from minority ethnic groups, children from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. But in contrast, even though we generally think that the level of language ability that a child enters school with is predictive of that child's academic success, there's very little research looking at children who are at risk for oral language or written language impairment and how they do in immersion programs. And this is what this project sets out to do. So this is our study at a glance. So we're following children from the beginning of kindergarten until the end of grade 4. In kindergarten, they're tested at the beginning and at the end, and in subsequent grades, they're tested only at the end. We are currently where the red arrow is. So just last week, the grade 2 children finished their testing of our first cohort. We have 3 cohorts. I will only be reporting our largest cohort, the cohort 1. And I will only be reporting on the French immersion students, even though we have a control group of English program children, but though that group is still too small to really run any analyses with. So our research questions are, our first question is, do the risk for oral language difficulty and written language difficulty overlap, or are they distinct profiles? So is it the case that a child who does poorly in oral language ability will also do poorly in written language skills, and vice versa? We want to know what factors account for how children do in oral language and in their reading skills in French immersion students, and how accurately and reliably do predictors based on the first language abilities predict how they will do in their second language. So what can we look at the beginning of kindergarten in these first language English children to tell us about how they will perform in French down the road in their immersion program? And how early can we identify risk for difficulty in these French immersion students? So our participants are from a school board on the South Shore of Montreal. This cohort that I'm reporting on has 86 children. They're all in early French immersion, so kindergarten and grade 1 is exclusively in French, and then starting in grade 2 they have a little bit of English. They are fairly representative of the population at large in that most of them are typically developing, but a small group are at risk for oral language or written language difficulty. And the testing was all done individually. We have oral and written language testing in French and in English. And our literacy testing was actually done right from the beginning of kindergarten, the point at which children have not received formal instruction in literacy. So to begin with, I'd like to focus on the differential characteristics of risk for language impairment and reading impairment. So we'll be focusing on the kindergarten results for now. So a specific language impairment is a disorder that affects specifically oral language difficulty. It's persistent over time. And dyslexia is a disorder that affects decoding, and it's persistent over time. Historically, these disorders were seen as distinct. And starting in the mid-'80s, researchers from each domain began including knowledge of the other domain in their work, and this led to some views of the disorders as being related. So this is actually a graph that was in a paper by Katz and colleagues showing 3 different models of these 2 disorders. And according to the first model, which was supported by Kami and Katz in the mid-'80s, they suggest that SLI and dyslexia are simply on the same continuum of one disorder, and essentially severity is what dictates what one has. So a child with less severely affected phonological processing skills will be labeled as being dyslexic, and that child will have only word reading problems, and a child who's more severely affected in terms of phonological processing deficit will have SLI, and that child will have written language difficulties as well as oral language difficulties. Then in 2004, Bishop and Snowling said, well, no, it's a little bit different. Both groups of children indeed have phonological processing deficits, but in addition, children with oral language impairments have another deficit that children with written language impairments don't have. And so they're similar but distinct disorders. And then very recently, Katz, Adloff, Hogan, and Ellis-Weismer said, well, no, if you look very, very closely, you will see that only the children with reading problems have phonological processing deficits, and overall the children with oral language deficits are doing okay in phonological processing. There's only a small group of children who are at risk for both and who have both types of difficulties. So we want to look at this question more closely. So our kindergarten test battery includes in the so we have language tests, literacy tests, and control measures. And our language tests have been selected on the basis of the fact that they've been identified as being good predictors of impairment, at least in monolinguals. And so we have the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals that includes oral language comprehension subtests, receptive grammar subtests, sentence repetition. Then we have the TEGI, which is a specific test that looks like grammatical morphology in English, so past tense marking, third person present tense marking. And we have the equivalent of that in French. So in French, children with SLI are thought to have difficulty with the past tense and with object pronouns or clitics. So we have a test that elicits those items. And we have non-word repetition in English and in French. In terms of literacy, we're looking at phonological processing skills as well as knowledge of the alphabetic principles. So we have letter sound knowledge, blending, elision, rapid onomatized naming. And our control measures are receptive vocabulary in English and in French. We have a decoding test, hearing screening, vision screening, nonverbal cognitive ability, a parent questionnaire looking at medical history, language environment, that kind of thing. And then a teacher's questionnaire looking at the languages used in the classroom and the specific literacy instruction. So the first thing we did was we wanted to see about this idea of overlap or distinctiveness, and we thought that one of the starting points would be to run a principal components analysis. And what that does is it tells you what groups of variables are most correlated with one another and what set of variables this first group of variables is least correlated with. And so we did that. We put all of our testing results into this principal components analysis, both in the fall and in the spring of kindergarten. And at both testing times, it looked like we had 3 separate sets of variables within which the variables move together, but they move separately from the other sets. And so the first variable or factor we called the language factor because we have items in here that have been correlated with oral language ability. So we have the TEGI, that grammatical marker test, the SELF, the oral language ability test. We have non-word repetition, rapid onomatized naming of objects. Now those two, non-word repetition and rapid onomatized naming, have been linked with written language abilities as well. But there's some work showing that when you're talking about rapid onomatized naming of non-alphanumeric items like colors and objects, that might be a better predictor of oral language ability. And when you're talking about rapid onomatized naming of alphanumeric items like letters and numbers, then that might best predict written language ability. So if you think of it that way, it's not that surprising that rapid onomatized naming of objects would come out in the language factor. And then our second component is literacy. So in there we have blending, we have letter sound knowledge, and we have decoding of words and letter name knowledge, that's right. And we have a third factor in the fall, that's age, and in the spring it's age and IQ that's in there. And with these 3 factors, we're able to account for about 65% of the variation in our data. So that's a nice amount of variation to be accounting for, I think. So this would suggest that maybe as a first step, maybe we have an indication that they are separate, these oral language and written language abilities. Next, I'd like to address the question of predicting early outcomes. So one of our pressing questions is how can we intervene early? How can we identify kids early on in kindergarten? So our children are all monolingual English or English dominant bilinguals. And how can we best identify who is at risk and who needs help when they're in the French immersion programs where everything's going on in French for the first 2 years? So our grade 1 testing battery is very similar to our kindergarten testing battery, but we've now added expressive vocabulary just because we couldn't add that before due to time constraints. We had a huge amount of testing to do with these kids. And in terms of literacy, we're adding nonsense word decoding, word reading comprehension, sentence reading comprehension, and as well we added working memory measures. So to look at the question of what are the best predictors of outcome from the beginning of kindergarten to the end of grade 1, we ran linear regression. So what this does is it gives you the best combination of variables that best predict outcome. So on the left-hand side of the table, we're looking at predicting on the basis of the fall of kindergarten results, and on the right-hand side of the table, we're predicting end of grade 1 functioning on the basis of spring of kindergarten results. And so for both analyses, we forced in age and IQ. That's why those are listed separately there, because we want to control for those variables. And then we entered a slew of oral language and written language predictors. And what we found was that in both the fall and the spring of kindergarten, a knowledge of the alphabetic principle and knowledge of French at kindergarten entry are the best predictors of decoding, both word and non-word decoding. I'm not going to go into that much detail because I have more results to share with you. Then we ran analyses looking at the best predictors of oral language ability. And we found that sentence repetition was the best predictor of how a child will end up doing in their second language skills. But it's more complex than literacy in that there's a more complex array of factors that are also unique predictors. So we have receptive vocabulary in French and in English, and we have letter name knowledge that were important predictors. So far we've been looking at the whole sample. If we focus now on the children who look like they're at risk, so who perform more than one standard deviation below the mean, we found that by the end of grade 1, we had 11 children that seemed to be at risk for both oral and written language, 5 for oral language only, and 5 for written language only. And it appears the colors, the red simply means that the profile has been consistent since the beginning of kindergarten, and the other two colors, the children's profiles of difficulty emerged later. So it looks like for oral language difficulty, or for both, we can identify those kids maybe a little bit sooner than the children with reading difficulties. And so the last set of analyses pertains to predicting high and low risk. So we put the children into either you're in the risk group or you're not, and what best predicts what group you're in. And for reading, the best predictors in the fall of kindergarten were how they did with the past tense morpheme, which is surprising because that's an oral language ability, and the letter name knowledge. And in the spring of kindergarten, it was not surprisingly blending, which has been known to be a very good predictor. Then we did that again for oral language impairment, but we looked at how they were doing in English because we felt it was unfair to label them as impaired in French when they're still acquiring the French at this point. And it was sentence repetition that is by far the best predictor of what group a child will be in. And that's good because the literature does support that. But we'll have to wait until we analyze our grade 2 results to know if that's the case for second language oral language ability. So in summary, the small units of phonological awareness appear to be the best predictors of reading outcomes in the second language, as well as alphabetic knowledge. Also, knowledge of French at kindergarten entry does enter as a unique predictor of reading outcome in the second language. And risk for difficulty in reading development could be possibly identified as early as the end of kindergarten in French Immersion program children. Sentence repetition is the best unique predictor of oral language ability. And as well, risk for difficulty in oral language ability could be identified a little earlier, maybe from the beginning of kindergarten. We don't need to wait so long. And it appears that oral and language difficulty may be distinct risk profiles. Thank you. That's it. I have 2 minutes left.
There's 2 minutes of presentation time left. Answer questions?
Are there any questions? I'm sorry, I went through these very quick. I was afraid you ran out of time.
Can you explain a little more about the kindergarten testing? Were the tests done in both languages in the fall of kindergarten?
No, in the fall of kindergarten. In the spring of kindergarten, everything was done in both languages. In the fall, it was mostly our control measures that were done in both languages. So the receptive vocabulary, we did that in both languages. We wanted to know how much French they had been exposed to, because this is near Montreal, so a lot of the children have had French exposure. And we did the decoding was done, but that was mostly, no, so it was really the control measures. I'm sorry, I should have specified that. It's really in the spring, and then from the spring onwards, everything was done in both languages. Yes.
Is that where you got the knowledge of French variable from?
Yes. So we are allowing that French receptive vocabulary test, and that's one of the points I skipped over for time. But our assumption is that that can serve as the proxy for knowledge of French at kindergarten entry, because we also entered at the same time the English homologue, the PPVT. And the fact that the EVIP comes out as a significant predictor and the absence of the PPVT coming out as a significant predictor indicates to us that it must be more than just language ability that is the unique predictor at that point, and specifically knowledge of French. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You have worked with individual measures of individual differences, of course, in the study. I'm reminded of a series of studies done by Laurent in France on preschool and first year, where there is a massive variable, which is in-class participation in group work. Oral, in other words, oral reactions, if you like. And this is a massive predictor of future achievement in a variety of disciplines. It occurs to me that some of these variables that you're dealing with might be strongly correlated with those, and it would provide a sort of measure that some of her measures have not brought forward, I have not seen yet at least. Have you done anything along those lines in terms of in-class participation rates reading, anything along those lines that would illuminate more what you found here?
Yeah, if not. We have given questionnaires to parents about the extent to which they'll assist their children with homework and how much reading they'll do and how much, so to get a sense of what's going on in the home. Unfortunately, the classroom is not something that we focused on so far, but we still have 2 more years of this, so I think that would be a great idea to try and integrate some of that, because you're right that there's probably a large chunk going on there that we have not looked at. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any implications for attending immersion classes for the children?
Yes. In immersion schools, and just clinically in my work as a speech-language pathologist, the idea is that most people wait a long time before identifying difficulty in children who are learning a language. You know, we're just going to wait and see, this poor child is just beginning, and let's wait and wait and wait and wait, you know. And I think what this data is starting to show is that, no, we have indicators early on, and don't wait, because the intervention that they need is not some magic formula. You know, there are a lot of things that we can do, and let's help those kids along. And that's another phase that we hope to follow this project with, is to say, okay, on the basis of this identification, let's put this into effect and see if the rates decrease or what happens to these kids who are at risk. But I think this tells us that there are signs early on of who will be struggling, definitely very early on for oral language, and not far down the road for written language as well. And in fact, the teachers are surprised by that, because in the immersion schools, they tend not to address the issue at all for a long time. Part of the reason is they say to me, well, I don't know how he's functioning in English in his first language, so I didn't want to make any assumptions, you know, because they never have any interaction with the children in that language, so they're afraid to draw conclusions on the basis of second language skills. But I think we're telling them, well, you can use first language ability and look at their first language ability, and that can give you an indication of what's going on. Yes?
Do you know what proportion of the students had significant exposure to French before starting to use that?
Yeah, so
in Montreal,
yes, it varied a lot. So we had some children, and probably around maybe 20 to 30% who had very, very little exposure to French. But we had some children whose French was very close to their English, where we were concerned about, is this a good participant for our study? Is this child not stronger in French? And we had to really look at the language input and look at their scores and talk with them and see what was going on. A few children we ended up not pursuing the project with because they were stronger in French. But and the variation on the EVIP, for example, in terms of standard scores was from 47 to 95. So we had this broad range of French language exposure.
And a follow-up question, did language exposure prior to kindergarten do anything consistent to scores?
Yes, exactly. So in terms of predicting their decoding abilities at the end of grade 1, that was a significant, unique predictor, was how much French they knew at the beginning of kindergarten. It was. And that's interesting because another project was done in predominantly English provinces, and those results are not formally out yet, but of my discussions with Deborah Jared, who's in charge of that study, and her team, they've seen that it was not a significant predictor in their study, but there was probably much less variation. Most of their children had not been exposed to English, so it's interesting that here the situation appears to be different.
Time for one more question? Quick question, quick answer?
Yes.
You have.
Using this type of test as a screener, pre-birth and change conversion, I can see it being used to remove students from immersion at the early stages that have a major impact on the English program.
Right. I don't advocate that at all, not to be used as to filter the children out, but rather to identify. I advocate them putting a lot more support services in the immersion programs, because I think what's going on is some children not sticking with those programs because they don't have the adequate support. They don't have bilingual staff in most instances, and you need someone who can function in both languages and recognize the issues of both languages. And so I would use it more as a, he needs help, now who can help him, and how quickly can we get this help into place? Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.